Of course it was a dream. All the specialists have told him so, and he has nothing to prove the contrary. Indeed, he would rather have it thus, for then the sight of old brick slums and dark, foreign faces would not eat so deeply into his soul. But at the time it was all horribly real, and nothing can ever efface the memory of those nighted crypts, those Titan arcades, and those half-formed shapes of hell that strode gigantically in silence, holding half-eaten things whose still surviving portions screamed for mercy or laughed with madness. Odors of incense and corruption joined in sickening concert, and the black air was alive with the cloudy, semi-visible bulk of shapeless elemental things with eyes. Somewhere dark, sticky water was lapping at Ank's piers, and once the shivery tinkle of raucous little bells pealed out to greet the insane titter of a naked, phosphorescent thing which swam into sight, scrambled ashore, and climbed up to squat leeringly on a carved golden pedestal in the background. That, my friends, was from The Horror at Red Hook, a kind of crappy story by H.P. Lovecraft. Let us read what scholar S.T. Joshi has to say about this particular story. This story was written on August 1st through 2nd, 1925, and first published in Weird Tales in January 1927. The first of 3 tales set in New York, it may have been written almost on a dare. Lovecraft wrote to Frank Belknap Long that it represents an attempt to extract horror from an atmosphere to which you deny any qualities save vulgar commonplaceness. The story is marred by flamboyance, conventionality in its supernatural manifestations, and a suspicion of racism. I think it might be a little more than a suspicion. The figure of Thomas Malone as a supernatural detective is of interest in anticipating Dr. Willett of the case of Charles Dexter Ward. The Greco-Hebraic incantation in the story is taken from an article in the Encyclopedia Britannica. So this story, The Horror at Red Hook, which was written in 2 days in 1925, is the story of Detective Thomas Malone, who is researching and investigating the strange goings-on among the scary foreigners in the Red Hook district of Brooklyn. He suspects more than just your ordinary horrible crimes, but something supernatural going on amongst these scary folks who frighten Lovecraft so badly. And he suspects that a strange gentleman named Robert Soydam might have something to do with it all. He might be the leader of some ghastly magical cult that are up to no good, of course. So, this story, it is of interest. It was written during his New York period. He went to New York when he got married. Getting married was a bad idea. Moving to New York was an even worse idea for H.P. Lovecraft, because he wasn't really good with change, and he pretty much was frightened of everybody that wasn't like him. And so going to New York, where you have all sorts of different people all living together in a gigantic city, not the best idea for this guy, because he's literally afraid of everybody practically. And he certainly was afraid of a lot of the people in New York. Anybody who wasn't a lot like him, he found pretty frightening. So New York was a pretty scary place. And to make it even worse, Lovecraft couldn't find a job in New York. where a lot of these other people that he was frightened of seemed to be doing okay, or at least a lot better than he was. Because he was hopeless when it came to trying to do real world things like find real work. He was really good at writing. He would have made a good editor, I think. But he was pretty much useless at anything else real world. He wasn't really good with the real world, I think, H.P. Lovecraft, in a lot of ways. Most of his existence was a mental one. And he just wasn't good at keeping up with the real world and existing within the society that he lived in. So he had a tough time. And his racism and xenophobia did not help at all, unfortunately. It just made it worse for him. And he let out some of his frustrations in a couple of stories. There was this one, The Horror at Red Hook. There was a story called He. And he did do a pretty good story called Cool Air, which I talked about already. But The Horror at Red Hook is not great. So this Robert Soydam, he's up to some shifty things, this guy. He is a reclusive scholar, kind of an old fella, who seems to be spending a lot of time with these scary foreigners. And Thomas Malone suspects him of some dastardly crimes. And so, yeah, Robert Soydam does act awful suspicious. And even stranger is that as the story goes on, he seems to start looking younger and younger. And eventually, he gets married to a young woman. They go off on a ship somewhere on their honeymoon and are promptly killed by something ghastly and horrible. And then more of those scary foreigners show up on a little boat, jump on the ship, and demand the bodies of Soydam and Soydam's wife. And the captain's like, yeah, sure, take them. Yeah. What the hell? Yeah, just take those two dead people that died on my ship mysteriously. He said, sure. What's wrong with that? So yeah, that was weird. So these mysterious foreigners take the bodies of Soydam and his wife, row off with them. But that is not the last we hear of him, because strange, mysterious things are found in the basement of a building by Thomas Malone in his investigations. And he sees all kinds of crazy stuff. Stuff so crazy that when H.P. Lovecraft tries to describe it, we don't know what the hell he's talking about half the time. It is some interesting stuff that H.P. Lovecraft writes in this story, The Horror at Red Hook. He does let loose a bit his venom at these scary foreigners. And that is what makes this story notorious nowadays, The Horror at Red Hook. It's, like I said, not a great story. But people do talk about it today just because it is one of the stories that his racism and xenophobia are pretty clearly prominent. You can see what kind of feelings Lovecraft had about other people in this story. So this story, and there were a couple others where you do get that. This one probably most of all. A lot of his stories is not too prominent, actually, but in this one it is. And so it's worth talking about just because of that. It's kind of a hard story to ignore. It's one of those stories that you'd like to ignore. It's not his worst story. That was probably a story called The Street, which was even worse than this one. It was so bad I probably won't talk about it at all. But The Horror of Red Hook is not completely terrible. It does have some fascinating aspects to it. His whole experience, Thomas Malone, beneath this building and in this strange other world which he stumbles upon, full of ghastly creatures, indescribable things, the living dead, a lot of stuff that we just kind of have a hard time figuring out what he was experiencing just because of the way Lovecraft wrote it. He was probably at his most over the top as far as his writing is concerned. Usually Lovecraft's style is a strength in his stories, but not really in this one. His fears and his frustrations just permeate this story. So it is one of those stories that if you are really interested in Lovecraft, you've got to read. And it is in a lot of anthologies or collections of Lovecraft. Of course, I'm reading it in this right here, the complete H.P. Lovecraft, but you'll find it in a lot of places. It's in one of the Penguin volumes. It's in the Library of America volume. It's in a lot of places, the horror at Red Hook. So I felt I ought to mention it, even though I think it's kind of crappy. It doesn't really work that well as a story. The supernatural element in it it's both conventional and confusing, if that's even possible. Well, he manages it in this story. So yeah, there's that. It's interesting because Thomas Malone, the detective character, is a detective, which is the type of character Lovecraft didn't usually use. An actual detective who was investigating something. But he was trying to break into other markets, apparently, and one of the other markets, apparently, that he was trying to break into was the detective magazines, which were a big deal at the time. I don't know what he was thinking, because Thomas Malone is the wimpiest detective around. This guy literally faints all over the place. If something frightening happens, he'll just freak out and faint. Thomas Malone. So, not exactly a tough guy detective, not the type of character most readers of detective magazines would want to read about, because he was kind of wimpy. He was straight up a Lovecraft character, that's for sure. You know, fainting and practically going crazy and all that, but not a real detective story guy. I'm not sure Lovecraft ever read any of these detective stories. Otherwise, maybe he would know better, but, you know, maybe he wouldn't. He was Lovecraft after all. But that in itself is interesting. The character of Robert Sodam is interesting as well. We don't get much of him, but he is an interesting character. The actual stuff that these scary foreigners were up to, also kind of nebulous, but it did involve, sneaking more foreigners onto our shores. Yeah, so there was that, and probably some other stuff. Murder was obviously involved, murdering folks and making them disappear. Other kinds of disappearances probably involved in their black magic goings on. So yeah, it is an interesting story. It's just not a very good one, but I felt like I ought to talk about it here on Mythos Monday, since I haven't mentioned it up to now, and it does bear mentioning. So yeah, there it is, The Horror at Red Hook. One of the H.P. Lovecraft stories I don't particularly care for. But there you go. And like I said, it's not his worst. There are a couple of them that are worse. And they're both the same kind of stories. I'm thinking, like I said, The Street and He. There's a story called He that wasn't very good that was also written around this time. Shortly after his marriage broke up, because he was pretty much a complete failure as a husband. Really shouldn't have got married at all, this guy, H.P. Lovecraft. But when he moved back to New York, moved from New York back to Providence, that's when he started getting to some of his greatest stories. A lot of those stories I've already talked about, like The Call of Cthulhu and some others. But there you go. That was this one. Your Mythos Monday for today. Catch me tomorrow when I have something else going on here. I think it might be a tag. I haven't done one of those in a while. Okay, guys, you have a great day.